Hi, my name is Danish, and I'll be presenting our work on behavior use licensing for responsible AI. This work is the result of an interdisciplinary collaboration between authors from different backgrounds and institutions. AI capabilities have been advancing at a rapid rate. Today, we're all too familiar with prompts and suggestions when we reply to emails or text messages. And recent advances in the development of large language models have resulted in improved performance on a variety of NLP tasks. However, such advancements do not come without risks. For instance, it is now well acknowledged that such systems often generate fake or factually incorrect text that is realistic. To illustrate the point, there are even websites that challenge users to take quizzes to guess whether an article is machine generated or authored by a human. And it's not just limited to text. Video, images, speech are now routinely generated by machines that are hard to distinguish. In fact, we've come to a point where AI is being used to detect whether something is the result of an AI system. But then it seems AI systems are also now leaking information about the data, sometimes private data, that it was trained on. This is no surprise that some AI developers and researchers are now also worried about the use of their technologies. For instance, OpenAI initially did not release its GPT-2 model weights to the wider public. This was widely debated by the community as it was viewed as a step back in terms of openness. Others in the community re-implemented the model based on the paper and then released a version of it to the public. And a couple of months later, OpenAI released GPT-2. It's no surprise that there exists tension within the community, one that is trying to balance openness and responsible use, as open ecosystems built on ideas of sharing and collaboration have been key drivers behind the rapid advancements in AI. Open systems not only help advance the field, they also help probe, assess, reproduce, and improve existing AI systems. In fact, to promote openness, sharing of code and resources is encouraged within our academic community. And some conferences even go to the extent of denying best paper awards to papers that do not make resources available. But given the two extremes between releasing everything without controls or holding back open access, is there something that could be done that balances both? What about releasing with usage restrictions? Could this offer up a solution to help balance this tension between openness and closed systems? So let's first understand how AI systems or software in general is licensed today. Software licenses, contracts, and other such legal agreements at the minimum require a licensor, that is a person, business, or organization with exclusive legal rights over the assets, a licensee, a person, business, or organization that has been granted legal permission by the licensor, identification of the subject intellectual property, and restrictions. These could be geographic, temporal, behavioral, ability to sublicense, royalty terms, and other such terms. Now, some legal agreements may require users to explicitly sign or agree to terms before they are granted access, whereas in some licenses, the terms state that the user should only use the licensed technology if they agree to the terms. Two classes of licenses you may be familiar with are the open source licenses approved by the Open Source Initiative and Creative Commons licenses for attribution and sharing. In this paper, we propose that licenses should include additional clauses to ensure that inappropriate use cases of an AI service or solution are specified and avoided. This goes beyond compliance to existing laws, which may vary across different geographies. Companies, organizations, developers could use clauses in licenses as a way of controlling usage and user behavior to prevent unintended, inappropriate, or irresponsible use of their AI services and solutions. This can be done by including clauses that are either permissive or restrictive in nature. Permissive clauses, as the name suggests, grants explicit permissions for certain types of use, whereas restrictive clauses would only prohibit certain applications. Which form is best may depend on the nature of the technology and the degree of openness one wants to have while licensing the technology. So what's the AI community doing about the responsible use of AI? The community has taken a multidimensional approach to address the issues associated with responsible use. Ethical standards and guidelines are meant to state ethical principles and best practices associated with the design, development, deployment, and use of AI technologies. Instantiating such principles and guidelines requires the development of algorithms and design frameworks, as well as toolkits to study data model, bias, performance, etc. It's also important to clearly and succinctly communicate how an AI system behaves, and work such as AI fact sheets and model cards are steps in that direction. Finally, some aspects of responsible use are encoded in regulation and terms of use associated with AI systems. So let's look at how ethical standards and information present in AI fact sheets or model cards can be used to inform license clauses. After all, if the use of an AI system has ethical considerations at play, or that the AI fact sheet or a model card lists some limitations or identifies inappropriate uses, why not encode them in behavioral use clauses in a license? So let's first look at some examples of how ethical principles could be encoded as clauses in a license. Here's an example of an AI principle from the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI. We use this only for illustration, and this principle states, and I'll read it: artificial intelligence systems, or AIS, must not be developed to spread untrustworthy information, lies, or propaganda, and they should be designed with a view to containing their dissemination. As can be seen, a license could merely restate the principle as a restrictive clause, that the licensee will not use the licensed technology to enable the distribution of untrustworthy information, lies, or propaganda. And if the licensee discovers that the distribution is unintentionally occurring, the licensee will put in place countermeasures, including human agents, to prevent or limit such distribution. Let's look at another example, this time related to deepfakes. The development of an AI system must avoid creating dependencies through attention capturing techniques or the imitation of human characteristics, appearance, voice, etc., in ways that could cause confusion between AIS and humans. In this case, we may have a license that could have a clause to state that the licensee will not use the licensed technology in a manner that would imitate human characteristics and cause third-party confusion between AIS and humans. As we saw, in many cases, ethical principles, depending on how precise they are relatively easy to encode as license clauses. Note, however, broad principles such as do no evil, infamously used in the JSON license, are hard to enforce as they are very vague. But now let's look at examples of how information from an AI fact sheet could help the development of license clauses. Here's an example of a fact sheet for an image caption generator. In this particular model, it is noted that the model does not work well when the images have poor resolution or lighting. Perhaps given the limitations of the system, it should not be used as an accessibility tool, and we could have a clause to that effect. Here's another example, this time for a text sentiment classifier. The fact sheet knows that it does not do well when the text contains sarcasm, racially offensive language, etc. Perhaps in this case, it's best to avoid the use of this classifier on texts that are likely to have such facets, for instance, social media data, and you could have a clause to that effect. So we looked at some ways ethical statements and even information in fact sheets could be encoded as clauses. Now let's look at some existing AI licenses that have behavioral use clauses in them. One of the early prototypes from the Responsible AI Licenses Initiative restricted applications in mass surveillance, deepfakes, etc. And they provided prototypes for end-use software as well as for source code licensing. Similar to how open source licenses ensure that they remain valid open source licenses, the source code licenses required that the usage restrictions also apply to derivative works. A very recent license released by Big Science, which is a large collaborative initiative to train a multilingual large language model, contains clauses specifically to address the use of the LLM model weights. They include restrictions on crime prediction, deepfakes, etc., and also include some requirements inspired by AI ethical principle. Similar to the previous license, they include usage restrictions that would apply to derivative works of the model. Edge Impulse is a company that restricts applications of the AI service, and both Meta AI and OpenAI have terms of use on the use of their language models. So even though we see behavioral use clauses appear in some licenses, why aren't they as mainstream? Perhaps this has something to do with the community's deep commitment to open source, Or maybe it is just the lack of enough open access licenses with behavioral use clauses. So the modification of open source licenses to include behavioral use restrictions makes it a non-open source license as per the definition of the OSI. However, like the prototype licenses from the Responsible AI Licenses Initiative or the Big Science Rail license, licenses can still have all the hallmarks of open access, including free use, reuse, distribution, etc., but just subject to the licensee abiding by the usage restrictions while doing so. We believe that this could offer a meaningful solution to those worried about the use of their AI system and are yet committed to the principles of open access and collaboration. Now, including license terms is a step further than stating ethical principles or listing limitations, but they are truly only enforceable if the licensor chooses to do so. While the challenge of enforcement is not unique to our discussion, it also applies to open source licenses, for instance. We believe that even without active enforcement, license clauses can still serve as a deterrent. However, one challenge that is also likely to emerge from the creation of multiple such behavioral use licenses is that large collaborative projects would need to assess how such clauses might interact. For instance, some clauses could be stricter than others. In some cases, they could even contradict each other. However, all of these also present interesting opportunities for the AI community. Perhaps there is scope for the development of specialized domain-specific licenses and clauses that the community could share. This could also be in the form of a repository of standardized terms, licenses, similar to what we have in SPDX. The enforcement of behavioral use clauses also opens up the opportunity for collaborative mechanisms for enforcement or even the identification of violations. Finally, there's also room for the development of tools and frameworks that could help generate licenses from a library of usage restrictions, or tools that could detect and resolve incompatible clauses in collaborative projects, and further even recommend what usage restrictions one should include depending on the documented information in AI fact sheets or the results of experiments run on the models. I will now conclude my talk. Thank you for watching. We would love to know your thoughts about our paper and the idea in general. My email address on screen is danish.contractor@ibm.com. I would also like to use this talk as an opportunity to share that I'm part of a working group task for creating a standard around such behavioral use licenses for AI. If you are interested in knowing more or participating in the initiative, please drop me an email. Thank you.